Welcome to the podcast of All Means All. In this episode, Alessandra Imperio, Eva Kleinlein, and Valerio Rigo will talk about formative assessment of and for learning.
Why do we do assessment?
Well, the first question a teacher should ask himself or herself is not how do I assess, but why do I want to assess, or why do I need to assess? And so to identify the purposes of assessment. There are three different kinds of assessment, of purposes of assessment, and they are assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning. It is very difficult to fulfill all the three purposes together at the same time. However, it is very important just to know that there are three, and also to recognize that we have to find the right balance among the three. I will begin by talking about assessment of learning, because it is the best known one, since it was the traditional purpose fulfilled in the last century. So assessment of learning aims to certify or to inform parents or other people about the student's proficiency in relation to learning outcomes in the curriculum. It is a summative assessment in nature, it is formal, and it usually occurs at the end of a course or at the end of a learning unit. It consists of collecting information on what extent students are able to apply knowledge, skills and attitudes against a standard. And there are many methods to collect this information, but they are not exclusive of this purpose of assessment. And they will be discussed later in another questions. For instance, they can be tests, but also presentations, or any other written, oral or visual method. The role of the teacher here, with this purpose of assessment, is to grade products and also processes and report this information. Students usually receive a mark or a comment from their teacher and use it as an indicator of success of their level. When the purpose of assessment is to enhance or improve learning, in that case we are talking about assessment for learning. It is a formative assessment and it is part of the learning process. Therefore, it is an ongoing process that involves formal and informal assessment activities in order to modify teaching and adjust teaching during the teaching-learning process, and also to provide students with feedback that can help them to improve their learning. It is designed to make student learning visible and also to make them forward with their learning. The main ingredients here are descriptive feedback as an example of what good work is, but also it provides a clear direction on, for improvement and recognition for achievement. Other main ingredients could be support and also peer collaboration. Many methods can be used to collect information and make learning visible, such as focused observations, video or audio tapes, but also cooperative learning activities as well. And in this case, the main role is played by the teacher and by peers. Finally, when the assessment aims to give opportunities to students to critically reflect on their learning and to understand how to move their learning forward, or in other words, to develop metacognitive strategies, in that case we are talking about assessment as learning. So the final result of assessment as learning is a deeper learning and also learning how to learn. Assessment as learning is considered formative assessment as well. And in this case, learners use formal and informal feedback and also self-assessment to understand what are their next steps in learning. As a process of reflection, it should occur continuously. Many methods allow students to reflect on their work, and they can be criteria, rubrics, checklists, and so on. And as you can see here, the central role is played by the student himself or herself, and also by peers again. The role of the teacher in this case is just to help students develop, practice and feel comfortable with these metacognitive strategies. So as you can see, each of these purposes has different implications for the role of teachers and students, for planning, and also for the choice of assessment methods. Therefore, I think it is worth first answering to the question, why do I assess, before moving forward in the planning.
So how can the three purposes of assessment sustain inclusion?
Well, with reference to these three assessment purposes, we can plan and employ inclusive assessment strategies. In the case of assessment of learning, assessment can be inclusive when you allow students to decide in which form they want to show and make their learning visible. For instance, a student can choose to show his learning with, in a written, oral, or visual, or dramatic form. Assessment for learning is inclusive if the feedback is provided to each student individually or in a group, and therefore it is individualized for everybody in the class. Each student group can receive specific material and guidance to improve their learning. And finally, assessment as learning gives you the foundation to be inclusive, since students develop metacognitive skills that can help them to be creators of their own learning with their own times and their own strengths.
When should assessment take place in the learning process?
Time management is one of the most important things to bear in mind when it comes to formative assessment. As the French pedagogist Philippe Pernoud used to say, we cannot introduce formative assessment in a school system without changing it completely from its roots. And in fact, to introduce this crucial change, one of the most important things is how we manage time. We can identify three different moments in the learning process, in the assessment process, which are the before phase, the during, and the after phase. So what comes before, during, and after the learning process. How we give meaning to these three different phases is different from teacher to teacher, and it reveals the reason why we decide to conduct an assessment, and more broadly, it reveals the reason why we teach. We can consider the first part, the before part, as a diagnostic phase in which the teacher understands the level of a child and the needs of each member of the classroom context. As we will see in the structure chapter, it is fundamental in this phase to set goals and criteria. Criteria are crucial to not let the student feel disoriented, and to help them understand what the achievement in the learning process could be. In broad terms, we should consider the first phase, this before phase, as the phase of planning. Planning is not just something that happens before the learning or before the assessment. It is something that should come also after the assessment, because we we gather evidences from the learning process and from the process in order to reframe what we have done at the end and to better understand the development and implementation of the assessment and to further improve what has been done during the assessment process. The during phase. It is something that plays a crucial role in the activation of the pupil, and in this phase it's very important that we have to remember that it's not enough to be a good listener and good observer. A teacher must no more be the leading actor of what is happening on the scene in the classroom context. If we want to gather evidence, we have to allow students, in this case, in this phase, to act as much as possible freely and to move freely in the class and to explore the context and develop their points of view on the topics that we are assessing during the learning process. Célestin Freinet used to say that everybody likes to choose their work, even though sometimes this choice might not be convenient. And according to this, we have to allow the students to be able to discover their tastes, their inclinations, and their needs. To this aim, tests are probably not the best tool that we could use for, and it is very important to consider observation as something that could help us going in this direction. But we also have to provide documentary evidence after observing it. And we have to bear in mind two important things in this regard, which is you cannot observe everything and you can't document everything. You just have to select the important part of what you are observing and documenting, and you have to do it in the planning phase, so in the phase we just described before. Okay, now the after phase. So the after phase is probably the most peculiar one, and we have several different possible types of after. It could be after a teaching unit, after a school year, or after a school cycle. By and large, only if assessment is something that follows the student in its everyday life, even if in his or her future steps in life, it is something that we could consider as purely formative. A purely summative assessment tends to consider the final return of the test result as the after part, but it is not the case of formative assessment. So formative assessment should be a continuous process that allows the student to find in the assessment a functional element for any further learning. It is always possible to find further afters, so to speak, and learning is a process that never ends in itself. So to be effectively formative, assessment should stimulate the search for new horizons of growth. How are assessment processes generally structured?
So if we talk about the structure of assessment processes, we have to keep three things in mind. So the first thing that has to be considered when we talk about the structure of assessment are criteria or categories. So it is possible to work in assessment with criteria that are rather standardized, predefined, and curricular-based, for example. But we can also work with rather flexible, open, and experience or practice-based criteria. In general, they can be, therefore, either deductive or inductive, while deductive categories derive, for example, from theories and organizations or practitioners who deductively developed criteria. Inductive criteria develop, for example, from practitioners while they're working, while the assessment takes place, or from pupils themselves. While deductive categories in general promise more comparability, for example, they are used for the allocation of resources, inductive categories might be more suitable. They promise more suitability because they directly refer to the child with which we're working or to the child themselves, and they, like this, might put less stigma on it. The second aspect of structure, when we talk about the structure of assessment, is the strategies with which we are working when we do the assessment. So there are, on the one hand side, strategies of assessment that are more common, more obvious, like for example exams or multiple choice tests, quizzes and so on. But there are also, on the other hand side, more flexible and open strategies of assessment. For example, if we think of make learning visible material, if we observed students, if we take drawings of the students to understand their learning process, these are also strategies of assessment, or they can be strategies of assessment. So in order to choose what strategies of assessment to use, we have to reflect on the suitability and also the applicability of the strategy with regard to the student itself, to the aim of the assessment, and to the situation and context we are working with or working in. The third aspect then of the structure of assessment is the outcome. So most obvious outcome of assessment is something like a feedback. So there might be, we might think of written feedbacks or oral feedbacks. We can think of standardized or less standardized or open feedbacks. We can think of marks or grades, for example, at the end of the year or at the end of a test. So these are the obvious outcomes of assessment. If we think of them, we then have also to consider, we have to consider to whom do we address the assessment. Do we address it to the student? Do we address the student with the feedback? Or do we address their parents? Do we address ourselves as teachers with the assessment? Or maybe the school report? Another aspect when we think about the outcome of assessment is something I would like to call feed forward. So it's not just about feedback, but also to think about what happens next. So when we talk about feed forward, we could think of ideas and interventions for improving future learning and development processes. So why do we do the assessment? We do it to improve learning, to improve the development of a student, for example, or of a group of students. So therefore, thinking of what happens next about feed forward is a very important aspect of assessment as well. So to put it together, the structure of assessment, if we want to have it as inclusive as possible and to consider the perspective of all means all, we have to be very critically and to reflect very critically about the situation we are working in, the aim, why the assessment takes place, and then we have to think of criteria that are suitable for this child, for this situation, about strategies and about an outcome that reflects this aim. So if we use standardized or flexible criteria, both may be helpful in a way and may also be good for inclusive assessment, but we have to reflect critically. Strategies, we can use open strategies, we can use more standardized strategies of assessment, but we have to think critically about why we use them. And also the outcome. It is not enough to just have a feedback in the end of the assessment, but also to keep the process in mind, to keep in mind that after the assessment, a next learning process starts, and how can we learn from the assessment for the next learning process. So I think the structure in general of assessment, we always have the three aspects, but we have to consider each of these three aspects to be inclusive in order to really talk about an inclusive assessment and an assessment that is for all the students. So Valerio, what are possible focuses of assessment in education?
Well, the main aspect one is usually inclined to consider when answering the question, what do we want to assess, is competencies. Competencies is also related to abilities and skills. The three of them help conveying a broad idea of what a student can do in terms of cognitive, metacognitive, social, emotional, and physical processes. Content knowledge account for only a tiny part of these processes, but it is what teachers promoting purely summative assessment tend to value most. Conversely, students should be better understand their strengths and weaknesses. They have to be allowed to act autonomously and to face unknown problematic situations, which is to know what to do when you don't know what to do. However, not only competencies, skills, and abilities are what have to be assessed in a learning process. The quality of environment must be kept in mind when we look at the learning process and at the assessment in general, and at the potential inherent to the learning process. If it does not guarantee students the fundamental elements for their growth path, then we have to reframe and rethink the way we structured the environment itself. There are no neutral choices in education. To take care of the learning environment means to allow the pupils, the students, to move freely, to interact with others, to provide openness to knowledge and new ways of exploration of the surrounding context. Without considering the potential and the obstacles the learning process pose to the learning and to assessment, it doesn't really help us fully understand the resources that are available to our students. Now, we have to make a step back and ask ourselves, for which purposes do we assess? Certainly, one of the main tasks of school is to help students discover their interests and passions. But this is something that should not be taken for granted. Although a student might have a clear vocation as early as primary school, it may not manifest itself in a clear way, and we have to protect it. We have to consider it as something fragile. So often a student needs time to understand what he or she likes and to explore yet unfamiliar activities and contexts. Assessment plays a crucial role in the possibility of such a discovery. It can inhibit or facilitate the acquisition of critical awareness for a student's growth path. To this end, we should remember the importance of self and peer assessment. But we have also other tools like narrative assessment, for example. Narrative assessment is something that allows a student to talk freely about what he or she experienced in the past and tell to the class what he or she appreciated or didn't like about such an experience. Finally, it is possible to comprehend the competencies and the importance of the environment and the interest in a new light, which is the development of capabilities. When we think about our students and the learning process, we have to bear in mind what they are capable of being and doing. This perspective would be helpful to better understand happiness, well-being, self-realization as important acquisition of the whole learning process. Capabilities are, so to speak, the most important opportunities we can offer to our students in the direction of a life that they have reason to value. Assessment is a powerful leverage to understand the existence and the potential of such opportunities. Who should be involved in the assessment processes?
When we think about assessment processes and involved actors, we certainly firstly probably think about the students who are in the center of assessment somehow. Nevertheless, involved in the assessment process is not only a student or a child, but also other actors are involved. So it is not only about who is assessed, but also who is addressed by the assessment, who is involved in the assessment process, and who is considered to be an expert for the assessment process. So Building up on that, the first group still is the student who is, for example, in the center of assessment and who is being assessed or who is assessing himself or herself. But if we think about all means all, it is not only about specific student with specific needs, but we have to bear in mind that assessment is something that can improve the learning process and the development process of all the students. So assessment is not focusing only on some of the students, but really for all of them. Besides that, we not only have the student in the center of assessment, but we also have the peer group or the group of friends or the class who are also students, who also belong to the group of students and who are also somehow included in the assessment. So they can be perceived as experts, for example, but they can also be assessed as a group. So assessment doesn't have to have only one student in the center of attention, but also we could assess a group of students, for example. A last thing that is very important to emphasize when we talk about assessment and about the actor of students, it is necessary to not only assess students, but also to involve them in the assessment. So not to talk above their heads or anything, but to involve students and peers in the assessment process. The second group, which is also very obvious and also very often included in assessment processes in education, are the teachers. So we might think about class teachers or subject teachers, but we could also think of special educators or special need teachers. They are often considered as the main actors of assessment, but it is also necessary to keep then in mind that their ability to provide learning opportunities must also be assessed or addressed, because the learning and development of a student is strongly connected to what is there in the environment, what is given to the student by the teacher, by the school, and so on. So it is not only the focus on the actor, on the student, but also what does the teacher provide to the student in order to develop and to learn best. So this is also something that can be addressed in assessment. The third aspect or the third group of actors in assessment are parents and or caretakers, legal guardians, and so on. They provide a very different and very important perspective, for example, on the child, as they just interact with the child in a different way than those actors who are only working with the child in school. So it is very necessary to include parents in the assessment process and to recognize their opinions, their perspectives. The fourth aspect of assessment, or the fourth actors that we would like to highlight, are other experts. This might be very diverse in different contexts and also is very different from child to child, from assessment to assessment, because sometimes medical doctors might be included, sometimes healthcare workers might be included, psychologists, social workers, youth welfare, but also teaching assistants may be experts for the assessment process and may be involved in the assessment process in the form that they are considered to be to have important information that can contribute to the assessment. When we think about how to include actors in the assessment process as best as possible in the most inclusive way, we have to emphasize how they can interact with each other in an equal way and to talk about with each other on an eye level and to consider all the opinions within the assessment process. So we have to pay attention to the different perspectives and include them then in the outcome of the assessment. Moreover, experts and all the actors are not only part of the assessment process, but they are also in the learning and development process. So as well as before the assessment started, as well as after assessment ended, these actors are somehow involved in the learning and development process of the students. So this is also where actors play a crucial role and where inclusive education is necessary.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of All Means All. In the show notes, there is a link to the chapter in the open textbook. There you can find the transcript of the video and more information on the topic.